Friends, it is 3:30 and everyone from the panel has already joined. Professor Goldar has been there, and so are our three very distinguished panelists. So without any further ado, let us get going. Today, Professor Goldar will be making a presentation on his latest work, which is on relationship between exports and growth in Indian manufacturing, and econometric analysis with a focus on the recent experiences. And I'm sure everyone will find that analysis very interesting. I was looking through it, and there's a lot of very rigorous work he has presented in this paper. And all of us know he is someone who constantly produces very rigorous analytical work on different aspects of industrialization in the country. He's spent a lifetime, working on different aspects of productivity and what goes behind, what explains that, and how the employment patterns and FDI, R&D, innovation, and technology are shaping in the Indian industry. So he has been constantly producing very solid and rigorous work at his base at IEG in the past, and continues to do so. So we are very honored to have Professor Goldar presenting his latest piece at the ISID seminar series. And then we have three very eminent discussants. Professor Amita Batra at JNU. She has worked for a long time on trade issues and industry-related matters. Professor Manmohan Agarwal, who has recently joined as a visiting professor at ISID, but he has been also a dean at JNU and has been associated with CDS and among other institutions. And Professor Veeramani, who is a professor at IGIDR, Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, and again, a constant producer of rigorous research on trade and industry matters. So without any further ado, let me invite Professor Goldar to make his presentation, and then we will turn to the three panelists. So over to you, Professor Goldar.
Thank you very much. I'll try to share my screen. Is it okay? Can it be seen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Am I audible, or should I use?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, very, very good. Yeah.
I first of all thank Nagesh for inviting me to present the seminar at ISID. I also thank Professor Krishna and Rashmi Banga, who had earlier seen this paper and given their comments, from which I benefited. And although the paper is technical, but my presentation, I have tried to be like 75% non-technical and 25% technical. So those who are expecting a lot of econometrics might be disappointed, but when they see the paper, they will see all the econometrics. I don't know, maybe 75-25 or maybe 60-40, but as we proceed, we'll see. Now, this is the outline: background, context, conceptual framework, then analysis based on time series data, and then followed by analysis based on panel data, 3-digit industries. It uses annual survey of industries. Then a question of high growth industries, what is driving their growth? And then a growth impact of R&D and FDI, and growth impact of ISO 14000, industry level analysis and plant level analysis, and final conclusion. GDP growth since 1980 has on average grown at about 6% in India. Manufacturing growth has been about 7%. If we want to raise our GDP growth to 8 to 9%, we are often talking about that, then it cannot be done unless and until we raise the industrial growth rate to double digits. This is Rakesh Mohan and Kapoor 2015. And I think other people also feel that. But there are two challenges. One is that to have accelerated manufacturing growth, we would need accelerated export growth. But the problem is that, well, export growth was about, world market was growing about 13% in 2003 to 2011. It has grown at 1% from 2012 to 2018. And if we take the period 2008 to 2018, 4%. So the fact that world market growth has become much smaller makes it a challenge to have a faster manufacturing sector growth led by faster export growth. And the second challenge is, if we really want to grow fast in terms of manufacturing, there will be difficulty in fulfilling the commitment on reducing the CO2 emission intensity of the economy, because manufacturing accounts for a substantial part of the energy use. But in terms of share of GDP, it's only 16%. So if the component which is only 16% of GDP and accounting for more than half of the energy is growing fast, it will become difficult to really reduce the CO2 emissions intensity of the country as committed. Now, this is a conceptual framework which I later thought after I wrote my paper, and this will be new for the discussants. If you can think of a parameter alpha for India, which is the elasticity of manufacturing growth rate with respect to growth rate of world exports of manufactured products. Now, this alpha, which will also apply to other emerging economies, can be divided into two parts, gamma and beta. Gamma is elasticity of our GVA to our export, and second part is elasticity of our export to world exports, which is beta. Now, gamma portion is the one where we are interested now in this paper. Beta portion has been studied earlier. There are a lot of studies which, and I report here, Birmani, Goldar, Biramani Bhatt. Dr. Birmani is one of the discussant. And in this paper, for example, estimate for beta is 1.5 for textiles, 0.5. There are other studies where beta is estimated. Now, interest in this paper is in gamma. What is the importance of gamma? Now, if gamma is say 1, which means if we have to raise our manufacturing growth rate from 7% to 10%, then we need a 3% increase in export growth rate from 8% to 11%, which will not be difficult. But if gamma is 0.2, then to raise our manufacturing growth rate from 7% to 10%, our export growth rate will have to reach 23%, which is very difficult given that the world market is growing at the rate of 4% only. On the other hand, if gamma is 0.5, our export growth rate requirement is about 14% per year. Currently, it is about 8. And this will mean that we have to increase our market share by 10% every year. Not altogether unachievable, but difficult. It is a situation like this. I don't know if you can see it. This is the share of Indian exports in global market exports. And if we have to really reach the double-digit growth, and our gamma is really 0.5, then we have to go along the blue line. And so that may be difficult looking at the trend past. Past growth is about, in share, India's share in world market of manufacturing is 2.8%. And we now need 10% growth in the share if the gamma is 0.5. So what is the gamma? I'm showing why is this gamma number important. Similarly, look at the economic slowdown story, which is that India's growth rate was in 2019-20 was 4%, lowest in a decade. This is a paper by Poonam Gupta and Tyagi 2022. Manufacturing growth was 8% during 2003 to 2018, and 7.5% from 2012 to 2018. And 2019, the growth rate was minus 2.9%. So both in, there was a major negative turnaround in manufacturing growth. And same story for manufacturing goods exports. It was 8% during 2016 to 18 and minus 5% during 19. So the question is, if this negative growth turnaround is about 10% in GVA and negative turnaround is about 10%, more than about 10% in exports, a little more than. And if we think that fall in manufacturing growth has happened mostly because of the fall in growth of exports, then we are implicitly assuming gamma to be high, about say 0.6 or 0.1. On the other hand, if gamma is low, that means this economic slowdown has nothing to do with exports. And there is a really problem coming from the domestic economy. And if we need policy action should be in the domestic economy. So what number gamma we get, that determines where the policy action has to be. If it has to be an external market action or the domestic market action. Now, in the 2019 situation where there was a much marked fall, as I've written here, export growth rate minus 5%, down from 8%, and GVA growth rate minus 3%, down from 7%. If it appears that A has maybe the main reason, that is export growth rate slow down, maybe the main reason, or at least one important reason. But there are some doubts. The doubts arise because only 7% of factories in India export, and only 4% of output is exported. If the domestic market is intact and growing, how can export cause a decline in the GVA? But there are possibilities. Maybe these numbers are somewhat underestimated. There are maybe indirect exports. Maybe there are linkages between exporting and non-exporting firms. And altogether, it's possible that despite the share of export in output being less, maybe there is an effect. Now, let me move to the time series model. Here, what is happening is trying to explain the manufacturing real GVA growth, and 5 variables have been chosen. India's non-oil exports, GDP of OECD countries, growth rate in the GVA of trade, repair, transport services, they are basically infrastructure related services, growth rate in power generation, and the price of crude oil vis-a-vis the manufacturing index growth prices. So relative cost of crude oil. And if this is the model, and the model fits the data well, and the model predicts that 2019 there will be a negative growth, and it did happen. And the main result is, it is showing that OECD countries' GDP has a positive effect, power generation has a positive effect, GDP of trade, transport, communication sector has a positive effect on manufacturing growth. Crude oil price increases have a negative effect. There are several earlier studies which found negative effect. The elasticity number, the gamma I was talking so far, is found to be 0.44. But another variant of this model, after the GDP of OECD countries drop, the elasticity is found to be 0.17. So it seems that the elasticity is somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4. That is the first. This is the estimate. I'll not spend time here. It's an ARDL model, and these are the long run coefficients, and there is indication that there is co-integration. Now let's move to the panel data, which uses 69 industries data for 2014 to 2019. And earlier, now here, we are, what I'm doing is, first we are estimating the quantile regression and panel quantile regression, and then it is followed by the generalized method of movements estimator. Why this is being done will become clear as we proceed. Now, this is the distribution of growth rates. In 2019 is the left-hand side block, and 2016 to 18 is the right-hand side. You can see in the now 2019 median growth rate across 69 industries minus 2.6, and 16 to 18 the median growth rate was 9%. And most growth were positive in 2016 to 19, average of course. And many cases the growth rate was negative in 2019. Also, there is a, I don't know if you can see this graph. This is the median growth rate, Q1 and Q3. And 2019, there is a sharp fall in median, Q1, Q3, everything came down. This shows the distribution of the growth rates in output and growth rate in export. They don't look normal, particularly growth rate in output, and all the parameters I have given, skewness, kurtosis, and tests. It says it's not a normal distribution. So if it is not a normal distribution, estimating a quantile regression is more logical. So the key findings are, at the median of the growth rate distribution, the elasticity of GVA growth to export growth is 0.2. In the quantile regression, 0.22, and panel quantile regression, 0.18. So it is saying 0.2, which is broadly also the time series one model said 0.2. Profitability is an important factor determining growth. Exports contribute to growth, But in low and medium growth industries, say in the range of -20 to 10, but for high growth industries which are growing at 20% per annum or more, their growth is not so much by export, they have other reasons for it. And impact of profitability becomes bigger and bigger with higher growth industries. This is the estimate of the quantile regression. Again, I will not spend too much time on this. These are the coefficients, and then there are 3 variables have been used: growth rate in exports, export intensity, and profit rate. And coefficients are significant, but the right hand side, I don't know if it is visible to you, from 75 percentile and 80th percentile, the coefficients become statistically significant only at at 10%. Or if you look at this one, panel quantile, 70th percentile, 75th percentile, 80th percentile, the coefficients are not significant, meaning thereby that export growth has an impact on the 20th percentile, 25th, that is low end of the distribution, middle of the distribution, but not at the high end of the growth rate distribution. So therefore, it's the high growth industries, the export is not the cause, they are going through certain other ways. This shows how the coefficient has moved over time. This is the coefficient, our estimate, the estimate of parameter I said gamma, how it has changes from percentiles, from 20th percentile, 30th percentile, and so on. You can see that the coefficient is about little less than 0.2 up to 50th percentile, and after 50th percentile, it goes down and comes to 0.1 and even less. And this is the effect of profitability on growth at different percentiles, and you can see it comes from 2 at the 20th percentile. When I say 20th percentile, means these are growing very low or negative, to middle about 3, top end, which is high growth industries, the profit effect on growth is 5. This shows how the profit rate and growth rate in Indian manufacturing has moved over time. And you can see there is a phase when profit rate is going up, growth rate is going up, then profit rate comes down, growth rate comes down, and more lately, profit rate has been dipping, but growth rate has been dipping much more. So there is, you can see that profit rate is indeed a factor behind the growth that is happening. Now, these are the high growth industries. This graph shows how many times the industry has crossed 20% in a 6-year period. 2 times, 3 times, none, 4 times. So this is the distribution. And which are the high growth industries in India? Processing and preserving of fish, manufacture of bodies for motor vehicles, manufacture of air and spacecraft, manufacture of medical and dental instruments. Other manufacturing group is there. The manufacture of railway locomotives and building and ships and boats. These in a 6-year period cross 20% growth at least thrice or 4 times. And average growth is more than 20% almost. So these are the 6, 7, all high growth industry. It's very difficult to see what is this reason, because some of them export ratio is high, some of them export ratio is 0. And so this is, for example, 329 industry. What it produces: decorative articles, ball and dot pens, handicraft, human hair, pencils, helmet, and hydraulic tipping, fabricated buildings, all sort of assorted products. And why are they growing so fast? I really know, I don't have any. So what drives the high growth industries? This needs further research. For each individual industry, you need to study why is this able to grow. But profitability seems to be one important factor. And some of them, for example, that fish industry, the processing of fish, that is growing on the basis of exports. Next, we move to Gma Estimator. The reason for Gma Estimator is coming because growth and profitability, one can say growth affects profitability or profitability affects growth. And output growth and export growth, I am arguing export growth is affecting output growth. Somebody say, no, output growth is affecting export growth. So there is a problem of endogeneity here. And by using of generalized method of movements, to some extent, we can take care of this. And generalized method of movements also will take care of being a panel structure, unobserved heterogeneity among industries. In this state of the study, 2 more variables are brought in: R&D and FDI and ISO 14000. And these are the main findings. Export growth and profitability have a significant positive effect on manufacturing sector growth, confirming the findings earlier. R&D and FDI in combination with export intensity has a significant positive effect on growth. Adoption of ISO 14000 has a significant positive effect on growth. But the problem is there is a very high positive correlation between R&D and FDI and ISO 14000. So the finding that ISO 14000 has a very strong positive effect may be mirroring the effect of R&D and FDI because of such high correlation. So unless until we are able to control for R&D and FDI, we do not know what is the net effect of ISO 14000. You can see the left-hand diagram shows distribution of industries according to the percentage of units having R&D or FDI or both. And right-hand side diagram shows the correlation between the percentage of plants in an industry having R&D or FDI and percentage of industry firms in an industry having ISO 14000. You can clearly see a very strong positive correlation. The correlation coefficient is 0.82. And with such high positive correlation coefficient, keeping both the variables in the regression and getting individual effects is difficult. I don't know if you can see this. Nonetheless, this is one important result, that is in this equation, the ISO variables are found to be significant. And one equation which is we are calling panel B, I don't know if it is visible to you, it's not visible to me in the screen. In that both R&D variable and ISO 14000 variable have been kept. But instead of counting percentage of units having ISO and percentage of units having R&D, the variable has been changed, in which a 0,1 variable has been created, and then a output weighted average has been taken. Because in that case, correlation falls a little, and then it becomes possible to incorporate it. And this is in the next bit of diagram tables. This has been more thoroughly examined by allowing lagged effect, dependent variable 2 lags, explanatory variables 2 lags, 3 lags, with lot of lags allowed. But all these results show that we are able to keep both the R&D variable and the ISO 14001 variable in the same regression. Both are found to be statistically significant. That means both are important for us. This study has been done at the plant level. Here, the correlation is very low between ISO and R&D, because some are doing R&D, some have ISO 14000. The correlation is only about 0.2. And this there is a data for about 15,600 plants, growth between 2010 and 2015, and certain explanatory variables that they used. Export intensity has a positive effect. R&D and FDI has a positive effect. ISO 14000 has a positive effect. I'm just looking at the clock, whether I have some additional slides. Nagesh, should I show or I move?
Yeah, please go ahead. No issue.
Yeah, because I'm just looking at the time, because I have some additional slides. I can move to additional slides.
Yeah, go ahead, please. No
slides. This slide is basically showing that when we look at the national accounts data, corporate sector of national accounts data is made on the basis of MCA 21. While organized manufacturing data here is made on the basis of annual survey. This is two different bodies of data. Both show for 2019-20, the corporate sector of manufacturing shows a growth rate of -2.8, and ASI shows a growth rate of -2.7, both confirming that in 2019, there was a decline of roughly the same magnitude, which is telling, which is a very interesting thing to observe, that both data are showing almost the same negative growth rate. Then these are the additional things. Question is the structure of the equation we have used. Profitability impacts GVA growth, export growth impacts GVA growth, export intensity GVA growth. So it is like three variables in the regression. But is that the right way of thinking this? Is it that every industry growth in export will have the same impact on GVA growth? An industry where export share is high, growth in export may have a bigger impact. An industry where the export share is 0, how can export growth, or 0 is 1%, how can export growth have much impact? So should we think that growth in exports depend on what is the share of exports in output? That will be conditioned by that. So maybe this is the structure, that is the more right structure. Growth in export will impact growth in output, but it will depend on how much is your export intensity. In export intensive sector, growth in export will have bigger impact. And in a not so export intensive sector, growth in exports will not have. So one industry where 80% is export will make a lot of difference, growth of export. An industry where only 20% exports, export will not meet. So accordingly, maybe we have an interaction term. But when this is actually done, it does not make much difference whether you have the interaction, you don't have the interaction. So even a simple structure that we have with 3 variables separate, or they are multiplied and their various interaction terms are tried, the ultimate result and the ultimate estimate of gamma, which is shown at the low bottom row, does not match, does not differ. It is ultimately, as far as the direction of effect is concerned, that remains same. That export growth is important, profitability is important, those come. But the basic estimator or explanatory power of the model or the estimate of gamma, they don't differ much. So although theoretically this is a better specification, but it doesn't. Let me conclude by the let me now finally come to the conclusions. So conclusion 1, finding is that export growth promotes India's manufacturing growth, and the elasticity is probably in the range of 0.2 to 0.4. But I wish more people do this sort of studies and find out what is the right elasticity, because I said this is very important for India's medium-term growth strategy. If our elasticity is low, we need to look at the domestic market. If our elasticity is high, we need to invade the world market. And the policy is growth in Indian exports need to be raised, and India's share in global market of several types of manufactured products need to be increased. And which category of products, where can you do it? Now we have some studies, Anand 15, Veeramani and Dhir 2017. And Economic Survey has noted that in the current situation, it presents India an opportunity to chart a China-like labor-intensive export trajectory. They emphasize the need for having assembly operations at a mammoth scale in network products, and the assessment is that India can raise its export market share in network products in the world. So this seems to be one line. So it seems it's possible. I'm just trying to draw some conclusions based on the finding. Conclusion 2 is finding is exports contributes to growth of low growth and medium growth industries. But in high growth industries, there are other factors, forceful drivers, and exports play a much limited role. Profitability promotes growth in high growth industries. So policy is, there is need for industry specific supporting policy for high growth industries. You identify some high growth industries on certain criteria, and we need specific industry specific policies to support such high growth industries. And attention has to be paid to the profit rate in high growth industries, because their growth very much depends on the profits that they have. Third finding is that R&D promotes growth. Obviously, the policy implication is obvious that India must raise investment in R&D, and it said in Economic Survey 2021 that India must significantly raise investment R&D to achieve its aspiration to emerge as the third largest economy in terms of GDP. And policies will be needed to make private sector industrial enterprises invest more in R&D, because the Economic Survey also notes that as a share, private versus government share, the India situation is very different from the top 10 countries. And in India, the private sector share in total countries R&D is very low, much lower, relatively much lower, and this needs to be. And the fourth conclusion, which is a very surprising thing for me initially, is that ISO 14001 promotes growth. And what is the reason is not clear. One argument could be that ISO 14000 promotes export, and through that it promotes growth. This is my paper in this ISA conference 2021, then Hay et al. 2015 for China, Blight 2021 for Ecuador, that ISI 24001 promotes growth, promotes export, and perhaps through that. Or there can be other channels like waste reduction, better financial performance. Kumar and Shetty 2000, this is Surinder Kumar and Shetty 2018, Surinder Kumar and Dua 2021, Working Paper Center for Development Economics, AC. So we need policies that will make adoption of ISO 14001 far more widespread among industrial firms in India. And this is likely to have relevance also in the context of BTA and what I have written, CBAM, I think, which is in the concept of border tax adjustment issues which are now being raised. And since this is a thing which is maybe coming, and we need to be prepared ourselves, so having ISO 14001 more widespread will be good. Now, according to a survey of the International Organization for Standardization, for 2020, among the emerging economies, China had 168,000, sorry, I can't read the number of certificates, but something like that, more than 1 lakh or some certificates. And India has 8,000 certificates, but we are doing best among the emerging countries. So we have really a long way to go. We have a long way to go. You can see if we are compare ourselves with China. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Goldar. I think very solid and comprehensive treatment of growth of manufacturing and exports, and number of very sensible conclusions and findings emerge that are very critical to enhance the export growth if we want to really reach the robust rates of growth of manufacturing, industry, and of GDP. The importance of industry-specific policies, and then criticality of innovation and R&D activity of the business enterprises, not just overall, but particularly the end companies begin to pay attention to R&D, which they don't as of now. And then the role of the ISO 14,000 type of standards, the environmental management standards, and increasingly with the attention being paid to climate change, adaptation, the net zero goals and all that. This will, I think, become even more important over time as we go along. So thank you very much, Professor Goldar. I expected nothing less from you. I mean, knowing your, sort of background and your previous work, I expected this kind of rigor coming in your presentation, which it did. So now let me turn to our panelists and see what they have to say on this very profound analysis. So I will go in the order they are listed. And so Professor Amita Batra on my list first, and then Professor Manmohan Agarwal and Professor Veeramani. So Amita, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Thank you for this opportunity to be here and be an audience first to this very rigorous work presented by Professor Goldar. Thank you so much for that opportunity. And it's good to see you, good to see Professor Goldar after a very long time. And I hope COVID has been kind to everybody. I think we've been affected by that. But as I can see, research has continued. So, I mean, as far as my comments go, first, I think it's a subject that's very relevant, that's very topical, and as was just stated, some very, very relevant policy conclusions that have come out of the analysis, particularly in terms of how India needs to push its exports, manufacturing exports particularly, you see, in order to have the right kind or the targeted rate of growth. And I would just like to add one more aspect here, that is, it's not just targeted rate of growth that we need, for exports and manufacturing productivity to be enhanced, but also significantly for employment, I think, which is the other major objective that India needs to grapple with, or is targeting at. So I think these are two aspects, very significant outcomes as far as this analysis is concerned. The second point, I don't have too many points, but the second point that I'd like to make here is, that of course, no questions at all as far as the rigor and the econometric analysis is concerned, several alternatives that have been tried. So I'm not going to comment on that part at all. I have no questions. But where I have some questions, which could be clarificatory, I got the paper only about 4 days back, So it's been a short time over which I've looked at the paper and could have missed some points. So some questions that I'd like to ask, and my very first question is with respect to the periodicity, I mean, when you say 1987, 88 to 2019, 20, that you've analyzed, this is a period that has a huge amount of policy changes, as far as India is concerned with respect to exports in particular, external sector, industrial policy as far as India is concerned. And in addition to domestic changes, you see that we've seen in this period, we also see many changes globally during this time, And even when I see your graphs, that you presented today, some of these 2000 to 2019, 20, there has been a very, very significant amount of change in terms of global trade trends during this period. 2000 to 2008, 9, 10 is very different from 2011, 12, you see, after which we've seen a slowdown in trade, then a recovery in 2017, and then some changes, or a constancy after that, as far as 18, 19 are concerned, So I'm not sure if these kinds of variations, both in domestic policy environment, as well as global trade environment have been taken into account when you are doing this analysis, So that's one clarification that I seek from you. The second clarification, that I, or rather as, something that I kind of missed out on, you have a couple of equations here in the presentation, but I didn't see a theoretical model at all in this analysis. It's a lot of econometric rigor, but there is no theoretical background, And why I say this is because I noticed 2 points that you have made here, one in terms of the reference to direct and indirect exports, and the other is the reference to large and small firms. The differentiation that you bring out in terms of the impact that, productivity and exports relationship in case of these two, direct and indirect, how one indirect could have been responsible for, the limited impact that you show, and how the small and large firms are very different. There is a lot of literature on firm heterogeneity and, trade flows, the impact of firm heterogeneity on aggregate trade flows, So if you could have brought in some aspects in this, in the sense of how different firms are related to trade flows, export flows, and consequently to manufacturing productivity, I think that would have been useful in just giving us a framework and a better sense to the reader, as to where you're coming from, Also, in some analysis, as I have happened to come across in my own research, you have productivity being positively related to or positively evolving as a consequence or, favorably under conditions that are of direct exporting rather than indirect exporting, to which you allude. The literature, some of the very significant papers, by Kalakrishna and all, they show quite a different result in terms of direct exports being favorably, productivity being evolving favorably as a consequence of direct exports, So how would you place that in your own context, in your own analysis, That's the second. And third, I have a little bit of a fundamental question here, I would like to say here, the world has changed, when we are talking about value addition today, it would be a little old-fashioned to continue talking about gross value added, The analysis increasingly, as far as export analysis, trade analysis is concerned, is done in terms of foreign value added and domestic value added as far as individual firms are concerned. Did you kind of think of this? Was there any kind of constraint that we see as far as data availability, specification of firms, or the kind of analysis that you're doing? Because that would be a far more useful way to analyze, when you're talking about R&D, for example. R&D coming in from where? Is it coming from foreign investment, foreign value addition, or is it domestic value added? Is there over time a change as far as foreign value added, domestic value added, the relationship with productivity and the other variables that you are citing are concerned? So I feel that just taking gross value added doesn't really make for the right kind of insightful analysis that one would like in terms of value addition, and a distinction between foreign value added and domestic value added would be useful if that can be, just one more section, one more part of the analysis. I think that would be useful. Lastly, my last comment, because you make many references to the China-like, possibilities for India in terms of labor-intensive assembly production and so on. I think here there has to be an understanding, because China, in terms of assembly production that it emerged in the early 2000s, was a consequence of its long period of policies, that it adopted both in terms of industry, investment, as well as in terms of trade, none of which we have adopted, we haven't, brought in the kind of policy changes that it brought about in terms of its input tariffs in case of, in case of specific sectors. It attracted investment in those sectors because it had the right kind of import tariffs or trade policies in those sectors, So in case of China, the trade investment productivity link, was established as a consequence of its long-standing policy, starting from, the 1980s, 90s, and then culminating in what we saw as China emerging as the factory of the world in the 2000s. Today, it's quite the reverse, where you see China having a much higher level of domestic value added as against foreign value added. Its entire reorientation towards producing everything, or more and more inward orientation, producing things on its own rather than importing, reduced emphasis on imports. That's been a process. That's been a process of graduation from increased value, foreign value addition, to now domestic value addition. All of this, I make a mention of this in my most recent book, by the way, which is Trade Policy in the 21st Century India, where I talk about and bring about comparisons with China. But I think, reference to what has been given in the economic survey as what India can do, there has been a gap between the kind of policies we have adopted, China has adopted, other emerging markets have adopted, and where we have kind of lagged behind in that. Those need to be brought in for us to reach these conclusions, because they are not obvious conclusions from the kind of analysis that you present through your analysis. Otherwise, I think a hugely topical, very, very rigorous analysis. But for these few questions that I have, congratulations on this very good work that you have here. Hugely comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you, Amita. I think Amita has highlighted a very important, targeting factor, which is employment creation. Why, if at all, we are trying to promote industry, manufacturing, and exports, I think an important consideration is job creation, which is I think most important and most critical challenge for the policymakers in the country at this moment. You have also pointed out the period which was kind of taken for this panel data analysis was a period of very profound change in the global trade architecture and landscape, and whether that had anything to do with the results that have come out. And then your questions are about the theoretical framework and whether the domestic and foreign value added could be really split. And also, finally, the policy gaps which need to be addressed to achieve the kind of shift China has managed to achieve. So all very important points that you have raised, Amita, and I'm sure Professor Goldar will come back to them, in the questionnaire, in the discussion. So with that, let me turn to our second panelist, Professor Manmohan Agarwal. And I mean, nobody needs any introduction of Professor Manmohan Agarwal. And initially, I did talk about his background, and he has been throughout his career producing a lot of research on all different aspects of development, and from his base at JNU and then CDS, and now we are actually looking forward to working very closely with him in his new role as visiting professor at ISID. So over to you, Manmohan.
Thank you, Nagesh. I would like to congratulate Goldar for drawing attention to the importance of the manufacturing sector. When the Indian economy was growing rapidly before the 2008 financial crisis, there was developing a feeling that we had bypassed the manufacturing transition and gone straight to high value-added services. And that has shown itself later to be a bit of an illusion. So I think it is very important that Goldar has stressed the importance of the manufacturing sector. Now, I would like to develop the point that Amrita has said with the changing domestic and foreign environment over the last 20, 25 years. And I think this has a deeper implication for the analysis that I think we should recognize. We all know that there is a concept of negative value added at international prices that Bruno and others work on the effective rates of protection had raised. Now, in local prices, value added is always positive, but at international prices, value added can be negative. So the question arises, at what prices should we value output? Should we do it at domestic prices or should we do it in international prices? And the conclusion of the literature, really, of trade policy experts has been that it is better to do it at international prices because doing it at domestic prices creates all sorts of distortions. For instance, you can show that rates of growth of manufacturing at domestic prices are positive, but at international prices are negative. So the rates of growth of output of productivity can be very different at domestic and international prices. So I think one has to be very careful, therefore, of doing things at the right prices. And I think that will also explain to a certain extent Professor Goldar's puzzle about why value added in high value sectors doesn't increase even though exports increase, but that in low value added sectors, it does. And the reason for that is that in high tech areas, the value of export, which is gross output, goes up very rapidly, but the value added does not go up as rapidly because it depends a lot on imported inputs. Like, the classical stories of the apple, which is exported from China, only 5% is local value added, the rest is imported inputs. So I think it is very important to take account of these changes in tariffs, which have happened very rapidly. Like, for instance, you raise the tariff rate, automatically domestic prices go up, which means domestic value added goes up. But that's a kind of artificial growth and will not be sustained. So changes in tariff rates have to be taken into account, changes in exchange rates have to be taken into account, and therefore we should be very careful at what prices we do these comparisons. That is the main comment that I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Manmohan, for drawing the attention to a number of important points and your emphasis on the manufacturing sector, which Professor Goldar has focused attention on, and why it is very critical for India's development. Then your point about whether it is appropriate to use domestic prices to value output or international prices because of the distortions. And then your clarification about why for high-tech and high-growth industries, exports may not be so important as explanatory factors, but the importance of imported inputs there might be explaining that. So very useful points, and I'm sure Professor Goldar will respond to your points when we open up the discussion. So let me now turn to Professor Veeramani, next panelist, and again, he needs no introduction for this audience. He has been constantly producing very solid, very rigorous work on trade-related matters, and I'm sure everyone will enjoy listening to him. So over to you, Professor Veeramani.
Thank you, Dr. Nagesh Kumar. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. It's a pleasure reading this paper. One thing is guaranteed when we read Professor Goldar's paper, that you would learn something new. I've been learning from Professor Goldar starting from about 2002, and I'm continuously doing it. And even in this paper is a big learning experience for me. You learn how to assemble data from various sources and then do a technically sound analysis and all that. And this paper also reflects his way of doing such things. So let me come to the paper. Basically, what the paper do. First, it looks at the question, does export growth lead to higher growth of value added in India's manufacturing sector? So that is the simple and straightforward question. And to answer this question, this paper does two types of analysis, but one is at the aggregate level, which uses data from 87-88 to 2019-20 and using ARDL model to analyze that. And then it uses disaggregated panel data analysis at the
can you move your slide?
Okay. I am moving that. Is it?
So I think go to the presentation mode.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it seen now? Can you see?
Yeah, we can see now.
Okay. So the second part of analysis is a disaggregated analysis covering 2014-15 to 2019-20. And the paper uses a variety of model specifications to show the results, including pooled quantile regression, panel quantile regression, GMM, and so on. And then it also looks at the impact of R&D, foreign equity participation, and environmental management systems on growth of value added. So this is what the paper basically doing. And the main findings are that export growth contribute positively to the growth in real GVA, R&D, foreign equity participation, and implementation of export environmental management systems contribute positively to GVA growth. And then it also shows that the decline of manufactured goods export was one of the reasons for the negative growth of manufacturing GVA in 2019-20. Now, I have some comments. Overall, this is a very well-motivated and well-written paper on a very important topic. So I have no issues with any of the technical sides of the paper. So what the comments that I have is basically to kind of complement the analysis that Professor Goldar has done. One thing I find here is that there is a very close paper which has come out in recent times, in the recent year by Chatterjee and Subramanian, our former economic advisor. This is a working paper which is available in the Ashoka University. And the findings that Professor Goldar get it here, of course, the analysis, the way that is done is very different. But the findings that Professor Goldar get in this paper is very similar to what Chatterjee and Subramanian also make. They say that contrary to the perception, India has been an exemplar of the export-led growth model. So that's a conclusion that they make. And then they show that the exports, both the overall export and manufactured exports, have been highly correlated with and critical to India's growth over the last 3 decades. So Professor Goldar also get a very similar result based on his analysis. So that way the two papers can be seen as complementary to each other. And then what is the policy implication of these results that comes out from this paper? The simple policy implication is that export growth is crucial for GDP growth, and then policies need to be implemented so that we get higher export growth, which can lead to higher GDP as well as employment growth. Of course, employment is not something that is analyzed here, but that is by implication it is there. However, one issue with this policy implication is that this is already an accepted point among the policy makers that export growth is important, because it is one of the major stated objective of India's trade policy. Whether it is Make in India program or whatever reforms that the government has been undertaking, they are aiming at, at least in terms of intent to get a higher growth. So there appears to be a consensus already among the policymakers on this issue. So, however, what is less understood is the actions that is needed to achieve faster export growth. What needs to be done so that this export growth can come? But this question is beyond the scope of the present paper. So rightly, Professor Goldar has not looked into that in detail. But my suggestion here is, can the analysis in this paper be made more relevant for drawing new policy implications, apart from reiterating the point that exports are important for growth? So can we make the analysis more relevant so that some new implications can be drawn with respect to trade policy? So that is what I am aiming at. So I find that there is a lot of scope. There is a lot of scope to introduce additional elements into this paper so that it can be made more policy relevant and currently relevant in the current context of the trade policy discussion that is going on. And this can be done by including a bunch of additional explanatory variables, including some interaction terms in the growth regressions that Professor Goldar has done. One missing variable, of course, two missing variables, which are very fundamental to any growth regression, which I notice here, is one is the growth of investment. The other one is the human capital growth. So I think the growth regressions, any growth regressions that we run, whether it's a cross-country growth regression or cross-industry growth regressions, I think it is a good idea to include these major fundamental determinants of growth in the regressions, because it is well known in the literature that these are standard variables in the growth regressions and they are shown to be very important determinant of growth. So of course, investment can be included for industries, a measure of investment, and human capital may be a little tricky, but Professor Goldar will find a way of doing that. I am confident of that, including some measure of skill, human skill at the industry level would be important. So that could be two control variables, which can be considered as in addition to those important variables that Professor Goldar has already done. The other thing Professor Manmohan Agarwal already pointed out is that I think there is an important need to consider the fact that import growth is also very important for overall output growth. This is something less appreciated in the Indian context at the current juncture, particularly capital and intermediate inputs, import of capital and intermediate inputs. And there are now a variety of endogenous growth models, some variants of the endogenous growth model, which clearly shows that capital and intermediate inputs can drive output growth through variety of channels, including variety growth, knowledge spillovers, and so on. So it is an important missing variable. And I think by including growth of imports as an important variable, explanatory variable, this paper can be made currently more relevant, because there is a discussion about more trade protectionism happening, control on import, tariff rates going up, Atmanirbhar Bharat, and all such things are going on. All those such discussions are going on the trade policy front. And by focusing on, apart from export, focusing on import as well as import tariff rates, or probably even effective rate of protection coefficients, I think by including those as the variables among the already existing variable, this paper can be made more currently relevant for policy discussions. And other important issue which I would kind of suggest to Professor Goldar's consideration is that I think this is an issue which is not studied well. I think what you export may also matter. It is not just aggregate export, total export growth, but the composition of export, what kind of products you export may also matter for growth. There is an international literature on these, which says that what you export matters. So there's a paper by Danny, Roderick, Hosman et al. Who show that if you are exporting certain products which are technologically sophisticated, then you grow faster. So but there are two views on this. One is that there is a literature which says that you should focus on improving export sophistication, and that would mean faster growth. And that would also mean in terms of policy that there is a need for strategic trade policy to improve export sophistication. But there is an alternative view. Alternative view says that you should rather focus on those industries where the country already has a comparative advantage. So comparative advantage conforming industries, that is where the focus should be. And in this context, several authors have pointed out an important anomaly in the structure of India's export. For example, this paper by Chatterjee and Subramanian point out that despite being a low-skilled, labor-abundant country, India's exports of high-skilled manufacturing goods and services grew more rapidly than low-skilled manufacturing exports such as apparel, textiles, leather, and footwear. And they point out, they caution that India's unusual endowment-defying specialization could limit export dynamism. So you can see that there is a debate there. There is a discussion that is going on. There's some group of researchers who say that you should focus more on technologically sophisticated products for export. Other researchers who say that you should focus rather on industries where the country already has a comparative advantage. And the question in the context of this paper related to this discussion is a growth implication of these India's idiosyncratic specialization patterns. So, and this can easily be analyzed in the framework that Professor Goldar has by interacting some technology or factor intensity group dummies with export growth variables. So you can create those kind of technology classification of industries and then create dummies and then interact that with the export growth variable to see whether certain type of industries classified on the basis of technological characteristics, whether their export leads to faster growth as compared to other industries. A furthermore reason to consider additional factors in the growth regression, especially those fundamental factors, is that Professor Goldar's paper says that growth in exports makes a significant contribution to the growth in real GVA in low growth and medium growth industries, but not for high growth industries. For high growth industries, the paper points out that there are other factors, other drivers of growth. Now, what are those other drivers, right? So maybe by including this additional explanatory variable, it may be possible to find out those additional factors which may be driving the growth in those industries. And here, one of the possible explanation could be that the low and medium growth industries could be, but this is just a hypothesis, they could be relatively more matured industries because these matured industries are already saturated, or their base values are already high, so that they achieve low growth. And while high growth industries are relatively new industries with a low base and therefore high growth. So matured industries may need export market to achieve higher growth because their domestic market is already saturated, while the new industries may depend more on the domestic market, so exports are less important. Maybe one explanation for that, but Professor Goldar can explore this further. This is my last slide and I will stop it here. Yeah, I have one more slide. So basically, the another finding that interesting finding that I see in the paper is that the proportion of medium and large plants located in urban areas, that is a variable that Professor Goldar included, and it exerts a negative effect on GVA growth. Now, this is a possible explanation for this. This can be seen in a paper by Ijaz Khani et al., which is a World Bank paper. It's also an NBR paper. They find that plants in the formal sector are moving away from urban and into rural locations, while the informal sector is moving from rural to urban locations. So since the analysis in this paper makes use of ASI data, this finding that is reported here is not very surprising, based on the finding by Ijaz Khani that the plants are now moving in the formal sector to the rural areas. And one minor point is that in the disaggregated analysis, the growth rates are computed, growth rates in exports are computed in current US dollar, while the growth rate in real GVA is computed in rupees. Perhaps, I don't know whether that's a problem, but perhaps a robust analysis by using real export growth rates also in rupees may be carried out. And finally, the paper incorporates short-term, medium-term, and long-term perspectives. For example, there is a long-term perspective when the three-digit level analysis is not the three-digit level, the time series analysis. The aggregate level analysis is provides a long-term perspective, covering a longer time period. Then there is also a medium-term perspective, which is the disaggregated analysis. Then there is a short-term perspective, where a disproportionate emphasis is given in the paper for the growth slowdown that happened in just 1 year, that is 2019-20. And my suggestion here is that part may be toned down a little bit, especially that short-term perspective. That emphasis may be toned down a little bit. To give too much emphasis on growth slowdown in just 1 year may not be appropriate this paper, as it may distract the reader from the more important long-term and medium-term issues that this paper is addressing. And also, it's a fact that this whatever that slowdown that occurred in export in 2019-20 was a very short-term thing. Like, now the exports are growing faster. It is growing very, very high rate. So it may not be appropriate to give it a lot of emphasis to that 1 year growth slowdown, but it can be analyzed, maybe little bit, it can be reduced in the paper so that the focus is not lost. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Veeramani. Again, very interesting set of points made, on the paper. Very useful. First of all, drawing our attention to this new paper by Chatterjee and Subramaniam, which is complementary to the results obtained by Professor Goldar, and your emphasis on what are the policy actions for driving growth of exports, and so bringing some additional factors which might lead to some policy conclusions, such as additional elements like investment and skill formation or capital, the human capital kind of factors, or import of capital goods and intermediates, and what is happening in the form of protectionism, how that affects. And your point about what you export matters. It is a very important point, actually, and there has been a lot of literature which shows that focusing on matured industry products, which are highly price sensitive, you get very little value addition in return compared to the knowledge intensive industries, where value addition could be much higher and the growth rate is much higher. So that is a debate which is very live. And so thank you very much, Professor Veeramani, to draw our attention to all of these additional points. I'm sure Professor Goldar will address them. So I want to now open it up to the audience, and maybe Professor Goldar could take up all the comments and additional points he wants to make at one go at the end. So is that fine, Professor Goldar?
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay. So I want to see who want to raise any comments or questions to Professor Goldar. Any hands? Please raise your hands on the screen. So maybe I think so someone is writing on chat box, and then Ananya. So Ananya, please go ahead. Ananya is a professor at Delhi University South Campus.
Good afternoon. It was an excellent learning opportunity being able to attend this seminar. Professor Goldar, I just had a very small query. So you had done the quantile regressions, which clearly showed that there is a quantile effect. So the last model that you showed us had an interaction term. And I think you had estimated the value of your parameter at the sample means. So I just wanted to ask you whether you've also tried out the values at different, ends of the distribution, given that, the quantile regression shows that the distribution, there could be some distribution specific effects. That was just the point that I wish to make. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ananya. So there is another hand being raised by Dr. Balakrishna. Go ahead, please.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. Thank you for this nice presentation. So I have a small query. As for the manufacturing and industry sector growth is concerned, so could you please elaborate whether there is an deindustrialization or there is a reindustrialization taking place in the Indian economy? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Then there is a question on the chat box by Moshmi. Excellent paper and discussion. Can identifiers be included for smaller innovative firms? Probably by the basket of high export diversified products. How can apparel, textile products create a brand value? What is the role of marketing as a plausible explanation? How can we relate this with the one district, one product marketing exercise? So Professor Golda, maybe it's time that you take the floor and respond to any points made by the three panelists and the three points made by the audiences, including one in the chat box. So over to you.
Thank you very much. All the discussants for the excellent points they have made. I don't know how much of it I'll be really able to do, but nonetheless, in a seminar, it's basically made for discussion and how we can make progress in the areas of research. I think the last 3 points, since they were very pointed, so I'll take them up first. Ananya has asked, I think, about the sort of new specification that I gave at the end and showed the results, whether I did them only for the median or did I try for others. That was not a part of the paper. You see, what happens is typically in my presentations, paper and presentations are different. Presentations, I bring in a lot of things. Like, similarly, a comment was raised that there was no conceptual framework. But in my presentation, I brought in a conceptual framework. So I did not try the final new modified form for the different percentiles. Because when I did it for median and I found no difference, I thought it's not worth pursuing it further. Now, there is a question whether we can identify technologically innovative, aggressive plants, etc. It is possible because ASI unit level data gives product-wise details, who is producing what, and some of the technology-related information like R&D, FDI, etc. have become available. But there is a limit up to which one can go. Perhaps prowess may be better. I really do not know. Perhaps getting a survey done, specially designed survey done is the best. But so far as secondary data are concerned, ASI has some potential. About the deindustrialization and reindustrialization, I have really no answer to that because that will take a lot of time. So I'll avoid that question at present. Now, let me come to the comments of the reviewers. Or the discussants, sorry. I have, of course, written them down. Now, for one point that was made, which is valid, that when one estimates a time series model using data for 20 years, is that valid? Because in 20 years, many things change. But there are hundreds of papers using time series data for 20 years, 25 years, and longer period. What can really be done? Otherwise, everybody has to do only cross-section data. So time series data, this pitfall is there, but whatever best one can do. So if there are certain concerns like changes in policy, the question is, can you incorporate that into the model? That is the best that can be done. But it is difficult for me to do it, but I recognize the limitation of this. Second point that was made is about indirect exports. Incidentally, the indirect exports discussion in the paper has come from a different point of view. The difficulty is that annual survey of industries covers almost the entire industrial sector. Annual survey of industries gives an estimate of exports, but this estimate of exports is only half of the exports coming from DGCI's data. So from where the rest half is coming? This is from the paper by Veeramani and others, 2015, I think. And then recently I did similar calculation. ASI exports is only 30% of the total exports, industry and manufacturing exports according to DGC. So this 75% of the export, which is a gap, then we are calling it is perhaps indirect exports, because ASI covers only if it is directly exported by the factory. But factory may be employing some trading firm. So that is not a direct export. So a direct and indirect export was used in this sense. As to why the reason why it has come is that if direct export is only 4%, how can export market impact the domestic manufacturing? So direct and indirect export, now I'm coming to suppose direct and indirect together make 10%. Is it big enough for the international market to affect the domestic economy if 90% of your sale is to the domestic market? This is the question. I've not been able to fully answer, but there are questions which are there. Then Manmohan made a very interesting point. Incidentally, this is one area in which I have done lately some research, and this question comes up very much into the people who do productivity study. It is well known that after economic reforms were done, productivity growth rate of manufacturing, instead of going up, had gone down. And there was no good explanation why this should have happened, because huge liberalization, policy changes, everything was done. But actually, if one thinks carefully, if the value added was measured at international prices, as it should have been, the productivity growth in the post-reform area would have been higher than pre-reform area. But we never have data to really measure value added at international prices. Anyway, I can go on into this as to why and how this has happened. And this also, I think, is connected with the other mystery, why manufacturing share in GDP does not rise. Because if the ERP of a sector is falling, well, the effective rate of protection of services is not falling, and effective rate of manufacturing is falling, then value added at domestic prices get compressed vis-a-vis value added at international prices. And this tends to create an illusion that share of manufacturing is stagnant when it is really not stagnant. But anyway, if all sectors value added are measured at international prices, we would find a manufacturing sector share in value added, aggregate value added, growing rather than falling. But Manmohan has raised a very interesting point. Perhaps some research is need to be done, but this is not the part. Finally, Veeramani has been my colleague from the time when we were together at ICRIA. And Veeramani and I had written, I think, a couple of papers. I think the report also I mentioned, that was a CGE, which Veeramani, I, and others did. So, and he has been very impressive work in trade, and in my paper, I have quoted him at many places. He has made some very useful suggestions. How much of it I'll be able to do, I do not know. But I should point out one thing. One suggestion he has made, I have already done, namely including the technology classification as a possible variable. I did not present the result because those were not coming out good. This classification has been made by Rajesh of ISID, which has been really kind to give it to me. And I have tried to, I first thought it will turn out to be very important, whether it's a high technology industry, medium technology industry, low technology industry. But unfortunately, in the econometrics, these are the mysteries of econometrics. Something you consider to be important, but it never comes. And something, so we have no control on this. Ultimately, nothing came. So I thank Veeramani for this suggestion, but this did not work. He also explained that urbanization variable had a negative effect And I provide some explanation, but I'm not convinced. I'm not at all convinced, because from regression to regression, this coefficient of this variable keeps changing. I have other regressions where I've done, which are not presented in the paper, where urbanization is found to be positive effect. So I'm not totally sure whether if more manufacturing units are in urban areas, that is good for growth, maybe because agglomeration effect. Or more manufacturing units are in rural areas, that is good for growth. So that is the reason I have not pursued this line, because that is not essential for the paper. So, but I thank him for pointing this out. But most important thing, I'll stop shortly, which he has pointed out is, shouldn't there be some analysis, something to take into account, A, imports, and 2, import substitution? Because perhaps growth in certain industries, certain periods, something can happen because of import substitution. Perhaps the recent growth, is it happening as the trade flows are sort of falling, and there is some sort of a protectionist or movement with some slight raise in tariff rate? Is it? I have not gone into this because that was not the focus. My focus there was to show that export growth matters for growth of manufacturing. If export growth rises, our manufacturing growth will rise. If export growth falls, our manufacturing growth will fall. Then you say, what is new? This is already known. What is new is, it is known what is the magnitude of the effect. What is the elasticity? Is it 1% rise in export will lead to 1% rise in GVA growth, or is a 1% rise in export growth lead to 0.5% rise or 0.1% rise? That is the contribution of the paper. It shows the elasticity is low. We need 10% growth, higher growth in export to have 2% higher growth in manufacturing. This is our problem. So export is fine. Everybody knows export. Now, investment, human capital, very valid points. I really do not know. And I thank you for pointing out the Chatterjee Subramaniam paper. I was not aware of it. And I am very happy that I have another paper which is thinking somewhat on the similar line. I was very excited about the ISO 14001 finding that ISO 14001 makes a big sort of impact, or makes an impact on growth. And I've had hoping that some comments will be there, either from the floor or from the discussants. But anyway, that's fine, because when something new is found, if it takes time for people to react, perhaps some more work will come to show that to care for environment is good for growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Goldar. So I think we have had a very rich discussion. I mean, the paper itself is very solid, and it was very well presented. And then our three panelists raised some very interesting comments and observations. And then some people from the audiences also raised some interesting points. And Professor Goldar has really summed it up and, answered some or provided some additional clarifications. So with that, I think I really want to thank Professor Goldar and the three panelists for giving to us a very rich discussion, very thought-provoking. And as Veeramani said, that it is always something, to learn from Professor Goldar's work. And this is not only him, but I'm included in that group, and many more. In fact, in the ISID, a number of faculty members constantly remain in touch with Professor Goldar and benefit from his mentoring and draw upon his expertise. So I really want to thank Professor Goldar and all of you for joining us today. And I'm sure we will continue this kind of discussions in our seminar series, and we will have enriching debates around the research issues concerning manufacturing and trade. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.